With Tony Ducks leading the Lucchese family, the mid-1970s was marked by the family's increased involvement in the private trash hauling business, construction in Manhattan, and numerous rackets in the Bronx. Salvatore Santoro, known as Tom Mix, had been a Lucchese capo since the 1950s and was serving as Ducks' underboss, while Christopher Christy Tick Fernari served as his consigliere. With the government well aware of the mafia's infiltration of so many industries, particularly labor unions, at the hands of men like Tony Corallo and Johnny Dio, it had prompted them to develop a new strategy to battle organized crime. Just a few months after Corallo went to prison in 1970, the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, had been signed into law by President Richard Nixon. The terms of this act gave the government the ability to pursue cases against criminal enterprises by combining individual crimes into a broader context. RICO defined 35 offenses as falling under racketeering crimes, known as predicate acts, and they could tie together those who committed those crimes into one case against the enterprise. It also greatly increased their chances of convicting crime bosses by only needing to prove that they ordered their underlings to commit crimes in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. Although it would be years before federal agencies applied RICO to criminal investigations, it would one day change the entire dynamic of the New York Mafia. In the late 70s, Corallo had moved from Queens to Long Island and lived in this home on Greenville Lane in Syosset. Now in his mid-60s, he continued to shy away from the limelight and be extremely private. He enjoyed listening to opera music, cooking Italian food, gardening in the backyard of his home, and going for long rides in his car. He was a fan of the British TV comedy program The Benny Hill Show and liked watching Western movies. He also owned a boat and would take some of his family members out on fishing trips. Tony spent a lot of time with his old associate, Felice Philly Black Falco, and the two would get some exercise by taking walks in the mall. Tony was friends with actor Burt Young, who once did enforcement work for the mob. Young was most notable for his role as Rocky Balboa's brother-in-law Paulie in the Rocky movie series, and Corallo and Young frequented establishments together. Ducks quickly became a significant figure in waste management on Long Island and had shaken down numerous carting companies. The Luccheses now added Long Island's private trash industry into their long list of lucrative rackets. Tony Ducks had become a tremendously wealthy man. For decades, he had numerous sources of income, both legal and illegal, in the US and abroad. His immense influence as a racketeer in various labor industries resulted in plentiful earnings from kickbacks, shakedowns, and bribes. The smart and savvy Corallo had legal fronts established to account for his income, and due to him having business interests in the Caribbean for decades, it's likely that he also had offshore bank accounts in his portfolio to store his undeclared money. While Tony was locked up, Jimmy Hoffa's sentence was commuted by President Richard Nixon, and he was released from prison on December 24, 1971, after serving less than 5 years of his 13-year sentence. After Hoffa's return from prison, he was aiming to regain control of the Teamsters, but his attempts at a comeback were met with heavy resistance from his former criminal companions like Tony Ducks and Tony Pro.
Bobby Kennedy was the creator of the Johnny Dio and the Tony Ducks alleged association with Jimmy Hoffa. Johnny Dio and Tony Ducks were two people in New York that you should know if you're going to avoid having anybody interfere with your strike.
The mob feared that if Hoffa returned to leadership, he would undermine their various racketeering and corruption schemes for his own gain. The incumbent union president, Frank Fitzsimmons, also had a decentralized style of leadership, which suited the mafia's interests well. Hoffa's return was seen as a threat, and a plan to eliminate him had been put into motion. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa set out to meet with Tony Pro and a Detroit enforcer named Anthony Giacalone, known as Tony Jack, at the Macus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. At about 2:15 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a payphone to tell her that nobody showed up for his meeting, and after that, the 62-year-old Hoffa was never seen or heard from again. There's endless theories about what happened to Hoffa that day, but it's widely believed that Tony Pro and his men were behind his murder. Tony Pro and his close criminal companion, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Bergiulio, who was also part of his local 560 union, were key suspects in the disappearance of Hoffa. But it was another murder which would come back to haunt Tony Provenzano. In June of 1976, Tony Pro, Sally Bugs, and two others were indicted for the murder of a union rival of Tony Pro's named Anthony Three Fingers Castellito, who was killed in 1961. Coincidentally, shortly before the trial was to begin in March of 1978, Provenzano's co-defendant, Sally Bugs, was shot and killed as he left a social club in Little Italy. On June 14, 1978, Tony Pro was convicted of the murder charge, and the following week was sentenced to life in prison, but immediately filed an appeal. In October of 1978, the former acting boss of the Lucchese family, Carmine Tramonti, died in prison at the age of 68. Tony Ducks Corallo was a member of the Mafia Commission and was now on the board of directors to oversee family operations, approve important decisions, and mediate conflicts between families. The structure of the commission had changed several times over the years, but by now it was essentially run by the heads of the 5 New York Mafia families, with some other high-ranking mobsters as consultants. On January 12, 1979, longtime labor racketeer and criminal cohort of Corallo's, Johnny Dio, died at the age of 64 while serving out his sentence at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. When the Bonanno family leader Carmine Galante became too greedy, ruthless, and ambitious for his own good, Tony Ducks and the members of the commission had a sit-down to discuss matters. There was a majority agreement to have Galante taken out, and on July 12, 1979, 3 hitmen stormed the Joe and Mary restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and gunned down Galante and 2 of his associates. In December of 1979, the Lucchese family was behind the largest cash heist in American history at the time. The crew under one of Corallo's captains, Paul Vario, which included the likes of associates Tommy DeSimone, Henry Hill, and Jimmy Burke, planned and executed a daring robbery of $5.8 million worth of cash and jewels from the Lufthansa cargo warehouse at JFK Airport. In October of 1980, Tony Pro's murder conviction was upheld and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. With Johnny Dio and Jimmy Hoffa dead and Tony Pro in jail, Tony Corallo was now the last remaining preeminent veteran figure active in labor racketeering. For many years, Tony Ducks ran closely with the powerful and esteemed Lucchese capo named Agnello Neo Migliori. Migliori once served as Ducks' acting underboss and was a huge earner who was deeply involved with construction rackets. He oversaw the family's interest in the concrete industry and also owned a successful marble business. Another close associate of Corallo's who served as his chauffeur was Lucchese capo Salvatore Avellino Jr., who was also one of his top men involved in the garbage and waste management industry on Long Island. Corallo continued to carry out meetings at establishments all over New York City and Long Island, and frequently held court with his underlings at the Ristorante Orlando in Huntington. By the early 1980s, some of the captains under Corallo included Vittorio Vic Amuso from Brooklyn, who had been part of the 19th Hole crew, which was run by Christy Tick. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, also from Brooklyn, arose from the 19th Hole crew as well. And Anthony Buddy Luongo from the Bronx, who had been involved in various rackets for the Luccheses. Corallo's control in New York's garment industry was still vast, and in 1981, he was observed meeting once a week in Manhattan with an individual known as his bagman to collect and split up shakedown money from various businesses in the garment center. In 1982, a Long Island carting company owner named Robert Kubecka had complained to the Organized Crime Task Force, known as the OCTF, about Salvatore Avellino trying to shake him down, as well as numerous other carting companies. Kubecka began wearing a wire and captured numerous conversations with various individuals, which captured them threatening him if he didn't comply with their demands. The wires had also led the OCTF to uncover that Salvatore Avellino was much more important in the garbage rackets of Long Island than they had previously known. Kubecka's work helped the OCTF win court permission to put numerous bugs and wires into place. Corallo was being driven around in a black Jaguar by Salvatore Avellino, and in March of 1983, the OCTF got authorization to plant a bug in the glove compartment of the car. As Avellino drove Corallo around town, it captured numerous incriminating conversations between them. Corallo was caught on tape complaining about an article in the New York Times, which mentioned him, his underboss Tom Mix, and Consigliere Christy Tick as being the leaders of the Lucchese family. Corallo was also heard expressing shock to Avellino that former Bonanno family boss Joe Bonanno had recently released a book in which he discussed the inner workings of the mafia and had also done a television interview.
You knew Al Capone?
Oh, I happened to know him, you know.
What kind of a man?
Al Capone was a very jolly guy.
Al Capone was a jolly guy?
Jolly guy.
They discussed how Bonanno had even gone so far as to mention the existence of a Mafia Commission in the book.
He was even saying there was a commission. He was admitting that there was a commission. He did. And on the TV, he didn't call it. He just says, I'm a father of a family.
Since Lucchese's passing in 1967, Dux had been on record as expressing an anti-drug dealing sentiment. However, since numerous notable Lucchese members were heavily involved in heroin trafficking, including the former acting boss Carmine Tramonti, it's apparent that Dux may have made it allowable under certain conditions, or may have simply just turned a blind eye to it. But after his release from prison in 1973 and the passing of the RICO Act, it appears that Dux had taken a rigid stance against drug dealing. He was captured on bug speaking to Avellino about killing anyone in the family who was involved with selling drugs.
I wouldn't be any later than I was with some of these guys because I don't want nobody out junkie. They gotta get killed. That's all. Who got to sell it? You can't be in the junk business without going to the street and sell this stuff. We should kill them. We should have some examples.
It also captured Avellino and Corallo expressing gripes about day-to-day business matters.
Says that Cody is making a beef and complaining about that because that was theirs. Let him go complain about Cody. He says this was theirs. This is the officer. Let him go complain about Cody.
Then a bug captured a conversation between Corallo and Avellino, where Avellino said they were being followed by authorities because they believed that Corallo controlled the toxic waste disposal industry, to which Corallo responded, "They're right." And perhaps most damaging of all was that Corallo was caught on tape discussing the structure of the Mafia Commission and explicitly mentioning the names of commission members. Once investigators overheard details of the governing body of powerful mob bosses acting in concert with one another, they were determined to capture evidence of a meeting between them. In the book The Five Families by Selwyn Robb, he mentions how authorities had inadvertently stumbled across a commission meeting. On June 14, 1983, a crew of state investigators and a hovering helicopter tailed Avellino and Corallo through the streets of Manhattan. They didn't know where their tail would lead, but it eventually ended at the Bari Restaurant Supply on Bowery Street. Seated around industrial restaurant equipment inside the store were Tony Corallo, Paul Castellano, and Fat Tony Salerno, getting ready to discuss business matters, while NYPD agents prowled outside of the store and scurried to get cameras ready to capture evidence of the meeting. Paul Castellano noticed a large man peering through the window, who he believed to be FBI agent Joseph O'Brien, who had been stalking him for months. Castellano immediately sounded the alarm, and all of the men scattered into the streets, narrowly avoiding the NYPD agents. Fat Tony escaped by having men squeeze him through a rear window. Around this time, Tony's son, Gerald Corallo, had become the president of the Local 239, the local which Tony had controlled for nearly 30 years. In the early 80s, Corallo moved into a 6,000 square foot home on 2.5 acres in an isolated area of Oyster Bay Cove, Long Island. And one of his neighbors who lived right across the street from him was Neil Migliori. Tony loved spending time at home with his family and was very close with his son Gerald and stepdaughter Madeline. As serious of a man as Tony was, his family knew him to have a dry sense of humor who would crack jokes, although he rarely laughed, and when he did, it was a chuckle at best. When Tony attended the wake of his older sister, one of her grandsons was crying, and Tony whispered to some relatives, "Look at that bastard making me look bad." He liked to joke rough with the boys in his family, and one time when his nephew Robert was 5 years old, Tony told him he was going to cut his throat and put a butter knife to his neck, then showed him his finger, which he had covered in ketchup, which caused his nephew to cry. Tony was extremely generous to his family members and would shower his grandchildren with gifts on every special occasion. Tony's brother, Salvatore Corallo, who was a longtime bookmaker and very close with his brother, had a trucking business in the garment center. He would throw some of his garbage in the building's dumpster, and one day a man from the garbage company showed up to his office and told him that he needed to purchase a sticker to put in his window and pay them a monthly fee in order for them to pick up his garbage. Otherwise, he would receive a ticket. Sal told the man to get lost and ignored his instructions. Then a few days later, he received a ticket and a fine from a sanitation cop. Several days after that, the man from the garbage company showed up to his office again, and this time the 5'5" Sal, who was in his 70s, threatened him with a pool stick, called him a rat, and kicked him out of his office. Sal then told Tony what happened, and soon after that, the owner of the garbage company showed up to Sal's office to personally apologize to him, gave him the sticker at no cost, and from there on out, they picked up his garbage for free every month. As Ducks continued having conversations in the bug Jaguar while being driven around Long Island, authorities were piling up information about his extortion of the garbage industry, and it was catching up with him. In September of 1983, Robert Kubeka had testified to a grand jury, and the following year, in September of 1984, Corallo was indicted with 20 others, and he was released on $35,000 bail. They were charged with conspiring to reduce competition in the carding industry through coercion, bid rigging, threats, and illegal agreements. According to the indictment, 24 carding companies were being shaken down and were paying as much as $200,000 to Corallo and others. The charges claim that Corallo and Tom Mix were splitting up as much as $10 million a year with the Gambino family. But Corallo's biggest problem was yet to come. That Jaguar bug would prove to not only be damaging to him, but to the entire New York Mafia. After years of investigation into the activities of New York's Mafia families, it had all come to a head. On February 26, 1985, the leaders of the commission and numerous other high-ranking mobsters were hit with a 15-count indictment. The indictments were the product of 5 years of investigations from over 100 agents, which included dozens of wiretaps and bugs, surveillance evidence, and witness information. At the time of the indictment, Corallo was in the hospital undergoing quintuple bypass surgery. He was arrested after he was released from the hospital and was freed on a $1.75 million bail. His underboss, Tom Mix, was also released on a $1.75 million bail. In addition to the commission case, Paul Castellano had numerous other charges levied against him and was facing a 78-count indictment. Castellano was released on a $2 million bail, but would never face trial. While Castellano was out on bail, he and his underboss, Tommy Bellotti, were gunned down outside of Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan on December 16, 1985. It was an unsanctioned hit which was not approved of by the commission, and when it was uncovered that Gambino capo John Gotti and his ally Frank DeCicco were behind the hit, the heads of the families were quite displeased at this violation of mafia protocol. Corallo and Genovese family boss Vincent the Chin Gigante were particularly incensed by this, and after consulting with the commission, they formulated a plan of vengeance. Gigante conferred with Corallo's capos Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso, and they agreed to orchestrate the murder of John Gotti with the help of a former Marine bomb specialist named Herbert Pate. After learning Gotti's routine when he attended the Veterans and Friends Social Club in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, on April 13, 1986, they put the plan into motion. Pate planted the bomb under DeCicco's car and waited for Gotti and DeCicco to emerge, while Casso and Amuso waited in a nearby car. When Pate saw DeCicco and another man enter the car, he drove past the vehicle and detonated the bomb. However, Gotti had changed his plans that day, and Pate had mistaken a member of the Lucchese family named Frank Bellino for John Gotti. Instead of killing Gotti, they blew his underboss Frank DeCicco to pieces and critically wounded Bellino. Even facing a lifetime in prison couldn't break Corallo, and authorities familiar with the old-school, tight-lipped gangster knew that getting him to cooperate wasn't even a remote possibility. By the time the commission trial had begun, the indictment count had grown to 25, which included charges of gambling, drug dealing, extortion, labor racketeering, and murder. The core mantra of these indictments was that the Mafia Commission used threats, violence, and murder to run their criminal organization. Several mobsters were also implicated in the hit on Carmine Galante in 1979 and were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The commission was also accused of sanctioning the murders of several Bonanno mobsters who were gunned down on May 5, 1981, which is known as the Three Capos murders. The commission trial began in September of 1986, and on the first day of trial, tape recordings were played to the jury. The first set of tapes was a conversation from the Bug Jaguar between Tony Duck's Corallo and Salvatore Avellino. The conversations from Avellino's Jaguar would become one of the primary building blocks of the federal cases against Corallo, Genovese family front boss Fat Tony Salerno, Colombo boss Carmine Persico, and 5 other mobsters.
Mr. Corallo, what do you think about all this? What do you think the verdict's going to be?
Don't know the first thing about it.
While Corallo was on trial, in October of 1986, Fortune magazine released an edition which identified the most wealthy, powerful, and influential mobsters in America, with Tony Ducks listed at number 3. The extremely wealthy Ducks still presented himself in a very modest manner. In an era where most mob bosses would at the very least be seen wearing expensive suits in public, he could be seen around town and at trial wearing blazers or cardigans. When Corallo became aware of the mountain of evidence against him and that he was likely facing a lengthy jail sentence, the terms of his next successor were being arranged. Vic Amuso, Gaspipe Casso, and Anthony Buddy Luongo were said to be Corallo's top choices, but he eventually settled on Amuso. Witness information says that by October of 1986, Vic Amuso was the new boss of the Lucchese family. On November 11, 1986, Buddy Luongo was murdered, and the reasons behind it are still unclear, although it's believed that he posed a threat to the new administration and that he and Tom Mix were planning to overthrow the newly appointed successors. Casso and Amuso were reportedly given the okay to eliminate Luongo, with the hitman allegedly being Vic Amuso's brother, Robert. Soon after Amuso took over as boss, Anthony Casso became his underboss, and the two would commence a reign of terror as leaders of the Lucchese family. After 10 weeks of testimony, the commission trial ended on November 19, 1986. The jury found that the commission ordered murders, collected payoffs, and oversaw a national crime network.
An anonymous federal court jury convicted 3 crime bosses of serving on the so-called Mafia Commission.
Tony Corallo was convicted of all 22 counts against him. The man whose very moniker was built on ducking convictions was no longer able to live up to his namesake. On January 13, 1987, Tony Ducks Corallo was sentenced to 100 years in prison. The other convicted mobsters from the case included Tom Mix, Christy Tick, Carmine Persico, Colombo family underboss Gennaro Langella, Colombo soldier Ralphie Scopo, and Tony Salerno, all of whom were also sentenced to 100 years in prison. Bonanno soldier Bruno Indelicato was convicted of murdering Carmine Galante and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Corallo began serving his 100-year sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. While in prison, he developed an interest in making oil paintings, and due to his years of involvement in the garment industry, he became adept at stitching fabric and would make drapes for the prison windows. In January of 1987, 9 carding members who were indicted by the undercover work of Robert Kubeka pled guilty to coercion, and the only punishment they received was community service. Up until now, the Lucchese family had been considered a very well-run borgata. They earned a lot of money, limited their use of violence, and operated about as secretly and efficiently as you can expect for a criminal organization under constant persecution from authorities. However, that changed immensely under Amuso and Gaspipe. The two were bloodthirsty and brazen. They ruled with extreme violence and ordered many murders, over a dozen of which were members of their own crime family. They killed big earners in their family simply out of greed so they could pocket the money for themselves. They were both extremely paranoid about informants and accused various men of being rats when they weren't. They broke cardinal mafia rules by having innocent people killed or badly wounded, and even targeted females and family members of made men. In December of 1988, Robert Kubeka also began working with the FBI to expose the carding industry in Long Island. When an inside man tipped off Sal Avellino about Kubeka's cooperation, he requested permission from Gas and Amuso to kill him. On August 10, 1989, 4 Lucchese mobsters stormed the Long Island office of Robert Kubeka and shot him and his brother-in-law to death. By now, Tony's son, Gerald, had also become a significant figure in labor unions. In addition to the presidency of the Local 239, he was also a trustee of the Joint Council 16 of New York, which represented over 150,000 members. However, Gerald Corallo had quit both of these positions in 1989 in order to avoid being questioned under oath by federal investigators. In May of 1990, Lucchese boss Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso were indicted on racketeering charges, and both of them went on the run. During that time, Lucchese capo Alphonse Little Al Diarco was appointed as the acting boss. Casso had been displeased with the New Jersey faction of the Mafia, and while he was on the run, he instructed Diarco to kill the entire faction, which was comprised of 49 men, half of whom were Lucchese members. After this, Diarco and other Lucchese members had become convinced that Amuso and Casso had lost their rational thinking and had become homicidal maniacs. After being featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, a tip led authorities to locate and arrest Vic Amuso near Scranton, Pennsylvania in July of 1991. Additionally, when the acting boss Al Diarco discovered that there was a plot to kill him, he decided to cooperate with authorities. The Lucchese family now held the dubious distinction of having the first boss of any mafia family to become a government witness. The neurotic and envious Vic Amuso even ordered a hit on Corallo's well-respected colleague and longtime capo in their own family, Neil Migliore, who Amuso viewed as a threat. On April 3, 1992, Migliore was in attendance at a party for a friend's granddaughter at Tesoro's restaurant in Westbury, Long Island, seated near the front window, when he was struck in the neck and upper body by a shotgun blast from a passing car. Neil was rushed to the hospital in serious condition, but he survived the bungled hit and went on to make a full recovery. Gaspipe Casso was found and arrested in 1993. After leaving a trail of destruction within the Lucchese family, to make matters worse, Casso also became a government witness. For all of the astuteness that Tony Corallo possessed in leading a crime family, that trait seemed to falter when it came to judging the leadership qualities of his successors. Diarco and Gaspipe's testimonies would get numerous Lucchese mobsters put away and cripple the entire organization from the inside out. A crime family which had been active since the early 20th century had seen their last days of prominence. While at Leavenworth, Corallo developed skin cancer, and due to that, he was transferred to a federal prison which provides health care for inmates, named the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. Also imprisoned there with him was his old associate going back to the 1930s in East Harlem, Fat Tony Salerno. Corallo injured himself from a slip and fall, and after that he was confined to a wheelchair and his health rapidly declined. On August 23, 2000, Antonio "Tony Ducks" Corallo passed away while serving out his sentence. At the time of his death, he was either 87 years old if you go by the birthday that he claims, or 86 if you go by the date that the FBI long claimed his birthday to be. A small funeral was held for him with only family members in attendance. He was interred at the Cemetery of the Holy Rood in Westbury, Long Island. Corallo had been the oldest living member to rise out of the original Lucchese family when it began under Gaetano Reina in the 1920s. A low-key and immensely powerful figure, the quiet menace Tony Ducks Corallo could be seen as the perfect prototype of a mafia boss. He operated from the shadows, abided by the rules of La Cosa Nostra, kept violence to a minimum, and made huge earnings for his crime family and his partners. A man who began as a roughneck and stick-up kid on the streets of East Harlem had earned the respect of stone-cold gangsters, but possessed a mindset which was capable of far surpassing petty street crimes. From the time he entered the labor union industry, his influence became so profound that his moves could send a ripple effect through the entire American economy. Tony Ducks earned his nickname from his ability to duck convictions, but he could only do so for so long. The very law which was motivated into existence because of crime figures like him and their ability to avoid lengthy jail sentences would also be the law which put him away for good. An obscure man who was so enigmatic that it's fitting that even his date of birth was a mystery. In true mafioso fashion, he accepted his punishment and took the secrets of his organization to the grave with him. Tony Ducks Corallo was a gangster to the core, but when he pulled the trigger, it wasn't a gun, but rather the go-aheads he okayed for decisions that could change the entire landscape of organized crime, labor unions, and politics throughout the entire United States.